Warren Buffett's got a great phrase, something like, leave your children as much that they can do anything they want to, but not so much they can do nothing.
Yes.
And, which I think is a great phrase. Now, obviously, he's talking with a few more zeros on the end than we are. But the principle, yeah, I think, is a great one.
Hello and welcome to the It's Never About Money community. Great episode today. I'm lucky enough to be joined by David Ward from Australian Philanthropic Services. And before I jump into it, I might just introduce David formally with his bio. He's got extensive experience and worked in banking for nearly 20 years before moving into the philanthropy sector. In that time, he held senior positions at ANZ, including the Chief Economist of New Zealand and General Manager Investor Relations, and notably he spent 4 years as the Managing Director of ANZ Trustees, which administered over 200 charitable trusts. And David sat on the Council of Philanthropy Australia for a decade and is considered a leading authority on private ancillary funds, which we'll talk a little bit about in this episode. He's conducted Philanthropy Australia's governance seminars and lectures at Swinburne University as part of their Asia Pacific Centre for Social Investment and Philanthropy, and currently, as I said, David is working as a technical resource within Australian Philanthropic Services. So we've got David Ward introducing. Thank you for coming in. How are you?
Good morning, Joe. Very well, thank you. Very well. Looking forward to the discussion.
So I might just, David, just put a general advice disclaimer at the front of this particular episode, just because we'll be discussing information relating to potentially some financial structures, but in a general manner. And that doesn't constitute financial advice to any individuals. And if any of the listeners of the community actually hear something today about something that might interest them, I'd strongly suggest that they seek professional financial advice to ensure that those decisions are made in contemplation of their objectives and goals and their family's needs and circumstances. So just thought I'd put that in at the front end, and we will start now. All right. So David, tell me a little bit about, obviously you've had quite an extensive career, but you've moved and dovetailed over into philanthropy and giving. And why do you think you've done that? And give us a little bit about the background as how you've led from where the economic side into the philanthropy side.
I think it started very much with my role at ANZ Trustees, that was the trustee of a lot of the large traditional trusts that have been in Melbourne for, in some of them, 100 years. And part of that role, you had to understand the investment side, you had to understand the tax side, you had to understand the accounting side, and you had to understand the giving side. And it was the combination of all those aspects that really got me interested. There are lots of experts out there, but they're often only experts in one of those narrow fields. And I found my role was spanning across all of them, and therefore trying to stitch it all together to make it work as effectively as it possibly could, both for the community in terms of the outcomes, but also for the individual families involved. So it was a incredibly satisfying role, and when I'd finished that, I thought, well, I'd actually rather carry on doing that rather than do something else in the financial sector.
Has philanthropy been in your family in any way? Were you exposed to any sort of form of giving growing up?
A little bit, but not a lot. Certainly both my parents were involved in education, and certainly there was a strong theme that education was really important. And I guess I took that on from education of your own children, which is clearly the first and most important priority, to then education of others. So a lot of the charity causes we support as a family, and also I've helped people set up, often have that bent on education as a way of dealing with particularly entrenched disadvantage by giving the old, hand up rather than hand out.
And it seems to me like we have had many guests on It's Never About Money talk about careers and trying to make sure that they have a career that has a sense of meaning associated with it. It seems like there's a bit of win-win going on for you, David, in the sense that you've used skills that you've acquired through obviously your own personal education and through your previous career that was able to really assist in the philanthropy space and gives about a sense of meaning for you.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, before I was in banking, I actually started my career as in foreign affairs in New Zealand. I grew up in New Zealand, and the first 7 years of my career was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, particularly in the Pacific, where there was a significant aid program. And again, the importance of education, the importance of schools, helping young people was a dominant theme in a lot of the aid projects that I was involved in. So that sort of was before I went into banking, and then that was helping people make the money in a way, and now in philanthropy, I'm helping them get maximum value from that money by spending it well through giving.
And was there ever a sense in your career where you sort of reached a point where you were thinking, what am I doing? And there's a sort of a lack of a meaning associated with the work that I'm doing. Was there ever that sort of moment where you sort of said, oh, look, I really need to change this. It's not working for me?
There was one moment that absolutely stands out, and that was when I was involved in running a team in ANZ. And a very, very competent, very good young lady came in and said, David, look, I'm afraid I'm going to have to resign. And she had just won, Associate of the Year the previous year and had a great career in front of her. And she said, look, honestly, I'm helping people who've already got a lot of money make more money. I really want to be involved in how do you spend that money well and get more value. And that was someone saying that to me, and it sort of, I think, in hindsight, maybe clicked a bit of a bell in my mind as well, and thought, well, if someone's doing this at the beginning of their career, maybe time that someone that's had a good career and established enough to look after myself and my family, that I should be thinking about that as well. But I think that was subliminal, that then just sort of played out a little later on.
And we'll get to this, but we'll talk about this more a bit later around families. But has there been any profound benefits for you within your family life, your sense of well-being, health, around changing your direction and your focus in your career?
Yes, I think just more the sense of, like, I'm in theory semi-retired at the moment.
In theory, I like that.
in practice, I'm doing so many different things that just pop up, and now it's literally a portfolio of a whole lot of bits and pieces. I'm involved, as you pointed out, with Australian Philanthropic Services, which has grown enormously over its sort of 10-year to 12-year journey. I'm also involved with some Aboriginal groups up in North Queensland, who helping them who've had an arrangement with a government department that means there's some access to the money for use of their land, and how do they now not only invest that well but also then start to run community programs so that it's spent well to again deal with entrenched disadvantage. So it's a very satisfying way to spend almost each day, and sometimes the weekends as well, and sometimes the nights.
Mm-hmm. So to dovetail into, I think it's a good segue into why people are actually motivated, you think, to give. Why do people give it all?
I think it's very personal, and there are a number of reasons, and I think different people are driven by differently in different aspects of these reasons. one of them is just simply the joy of giving. I mean, you think about Christmas, do you get more sense of joy from seeing, your child or your grandchild open that present and see what they've given, or from the socks and jocks or the shirt or something that you might be given? You get that real sense of joy from others. And then if you think about spending money well, do you change the colour of the curtains because the off-white that you bought 10 years ago is not quite in trend? Or do you provide a scholarship for a disadvantaged kid to go to, go to school, or help, save the koalas in a forest or something like that? The actual sense of spending money well and the joy you get or the satisfaction you get from that. Others give because they have a sense of, they were lucky to be born in Australia when education was free, university was free. They were able to make the most of the opportunity that they were given, and now would like to give something. Often the phrase give back is used, but it's really just share some of that luck benefit they received from being where they are. Others, it's a particular event. Like Australians are actually very, very generous when it comes to disasters. Whether it's a disaster of floods or bushfires here, or even the tsunami in Asia, Australians really gave a lot of money to support that. So they react to seeing people in immediate problems, and therefore they're motivated to give.
Is that also David, because the generosity tends to come as a result of a resonance with a certain issue, that an emotional. So the fact that Australians are giving more around emergency is also reflecting the fact that in Australia ourselves we do have these natural disasters quite regularly, and so it's our connection to the issue that creates the will and the want to help.
That is certainly part of it, Joe. And even often another reason I just got about to go on to is a family that has a disease that impacts on one of their younger members or one of their older members, and it's that immediate connection with a particular disease that you can go out and say, right, let's do some fundraising, or how do we make sure that medical research is paid for so that others don't have to go through the same trauma that we as a family have been through. So I think that immediate connection, in a way, activates a latent desire to do something, the latent desire to do something good, but you need a stimulus to make it actually happen.
Do you have an idea why there's been a decline in sort of active participation in voluntarism, as an example, yet there's been an aggregate increase in the amount of money that's actually flowed to charities over time? Do you have a...
Yeah, it's interesting, and I just wonder whether it's perhaps something the way some of these numbers are recorded. Like certainly voluntarism in the sense of, manning cake stalls and doing some of that things that people often used to do when they retired. And I think those numbers do seem to be going down. But on the other hand, younger people are actively engaged in all sorts of community activity that perhaps isn't recorded as volunteerism. It's I know,
and maybe the workplace as well, David. Maybe the workplace as well. Some places of work are actively involved in the community. It may not be recorded in the same way.
The same way. I mean, sometimes workplaces used to go out and paint a wall or something at a food bank, as a work effort, whereas now it's a lot more. My daughter, for instance, and actively involved right from a day at university and helping, refugee kids or people that's going out and doing, almost like, tutoring for disadvantaged kids in maths or other subjects. So they are involved very much in a different way, and I'm just not sure whether that gets recorded in the same way that that the traditional volunteering is recorded.
And you know, there are many different ways and modes of helping. Obviously, from direct donation to a specific charity, through lending your time or your talent to charities, not-for-profits as an example. And that's something that's quite clear and obvious and is well understood in the community. But what of this idea, and I know you're an expert, David, in this particular area, but what of this idea of the mode of helping through structured giving? What does actually structured giving mean in your mind?
Structured giving is really where, rather than giving directly to a charity, and it's not an either or. Often people who set up structures still keep on giving directly, but they set up a structure, a foundation is what it's often called, where you put the money in now, and then the foundation carries on over 10, 20, 30 years, sometimes in perpetuity, delivering out every year. So it's a different way of doing it, and it often is driven by a timing issue. There are times in people's lives, particularly in the business sector, or people, for instance, that might own one investment property, and when they come to sell it, they look at the money that's coming in, and potentially also look at the tax liability that might be there, and then say, look, here's a one-off chance to set up something to benefit the community. I haven't actually decided which part of the community I want to benefit yet, but I know I want to do something. So you set the structure up, you set the foundation up, and then you can spend more time and thought in spending that money well, and doing it in a way that it's sort of the difference between sugar and carbohydrates, as it were, or rice and something. Sugar hit is now, or you can give something that is going to benefit over time through providing regular funding. And I know you had the people from Orange Sky Laundry on one of your earlier sessions.
Nick
and
Marchese,
in a way, they have to raise money to buy the bus or the truck or whatever it is that's the vehicle that goes around. And that's often a crowdsourcing or fundraising activity that people can see the truck and give money to it. But that truck needs diesel. It needs people to run it. It needs maintenance. And that's more the ongoing support. And a number of foundations at APS, provide annual grants to Orange Sky Laundry and others like that then help support the ongoing operations of the business, because they run out of diesel or can't afford, to buy the stuff. That truck is going to sit there and not provide any real benefit. So you've got to have both of those things happening for it to work properly.
And so it seems like the idea of receiving a tax deduction for a donation into a sort of foundation is almost seen as the government's way of co-investing in supporting the charitable sector. Would that be your view?
It's actually a really good way of saying it, because in essence, if you're on the top tax bracket, if you put $1 million, say, into a structure that is tax deductible, that $1 million of that you would have had to pay $500,000 in tax. So you've put in half it, the government's put in half it, but you have to use that to support charities that you could give to directly. So it is co-investing is a good way of describing it.
And you talked about the sort of numbers that we're talking about. With structured giving, it does require a certain amount of capital. And we talk about it's never about money, but when it comes to this particular space and setting up these structures, it does require sort of minimum amounts to actually get started with these sort of things. So it usually involves a reasonably significant transaction, a sale of a business, a sale of an asset of some description, where the family decides, okay, we're giving away a certain amount on an ongoing basis anyway. Maybe we could actually structure it up in such a way that is effective for our family and gives us the ability to give on an ongoing basis and invest the funds that we've given away effectively within a vehicle for the purposes of charity. Could you maybe describe the differences between, say, we talk about foundations as the umbrella term, but the difference between the structure of a private ancillary fund, as an example, and a public ancillary fund?
I will in a segment just to pick up a point that you made there, Joe, which is a very good one about the investing side, and that and I'll give an example of one of our clients. I won't mention the name, but back in 2014, they did have an event that meant they were able to do something and put $2 million into a foundation that was then invested. And if we roll forward now 9 years, they've given away from that foundation almost $1 million. So they put $2 million in, they've given away $1 million, and they've still got $2.3 million sitting in there in the foundation. So that's the old back in your financial advisory world, the power of compound interest. If you can invest money and it compounds over time, particularly in this circumstance, because not only do you get a tax deduction for the money going into this, but the earnings within the foundation, because it's a charity, are income tax exempt. And you get your franking credits. Any franking credits that were paid if you invest in Australian companies get credited back as cash at the end of the year from the ATO. So you get not only the traditional compounding interest, but you're getting compounding interest within a tax exempt environment. So usually at about 10 years' time, in 10 years, people have given away sort of roughly half of what they put in, and they've still got the money sitting in the account, and they can keep on giving away, every year for the next, 10, 20, whatever they want. So that's one of the other reasons why people do go into that structured giving, to access that compounding interest.
And justifiably, David, that people feel connected to the source of the money. Obviously, they spent a lifetime working to build up this money, but as soon as they've put it in this foundation, it is effectively no longer their money. It's for the community, right? So, which is an interesting thing, right?
Absolutely correctly. It's no longer their money, but particularly under some of the structures, they have the ability and I would argue also the privilege and the responsibility of managing that money well. So if they set up a private ancillary fund, which is one of the key structures, the family can keep control of that structure. They can be the directors of the trustee company. So they're putting it into the community, but they still have ability to control where in the community that money is directed over time. So if they are particularly passionate about the environment, they can support environmental causes. If they're passionate about international aid, they can support international, overseas charities. So they still keep control of it, so they can determine which part of the community the money's going to, but it's got to go to, one part of the community. And you're absolutely right. They can't get it. They can't get it back. So it is community money, but they have that joy, responsibility, privilege, all of the above, to look after it and spend it and invest it and spend it well. Mm-hmm. So just to go back to your question, sorry, I took us down a bit of a diversion there.
No, I loved it.
There are three fundamental sorts of structures, charitable foundations within that sort of term. The longest established is just a simple charitable trust that have been around in Australia, for 100 plus years. The benefit of a charitable trust is you can support all sorts of different charitable causes. The downside is you don't get a tax deduction when you put the money into a charitable trust. So they are ones that are probably less popular today than they were back 30, 40 years ago. particularly because there are some newer structures that offer that advantage of a tax deduction. And I always say that people don't give because of tax, because they're still giving, some of their money as well. It's not all the government's money, but the tax deduction, if they're going to support charities that are tax deductible anyway, they might as well get the tax deduction up front and benefit from it, because it means they can do more. And the two major structures that give you a tax deduction up front are the Private Ancillary Fund and a Public Ancillary Fund. And the way I always say to think about these, it's a bit like super. The Private Ancillary Fund is a bit like the self-managed super fund, where you keep control, you do the investing, you do a lot of the compliance, you manage it yourself within a particular environment. The Public Ancillary Fund is a bit like the industry super fund. You have an account, it's still got sort of your name on it, you put money into your
someone
account.
else is doing a tax return and someone else is doing the governance side of it. Yeah.
Exactly, and therefore they're very similar in concept. I always, though, do point out, pick up your early point, the big difference with super philanthropy, you can't get the money back. You get the tax deduction. Yeah, you get the tax deduction putting it in. Yep. So it's community money, but you've got these two, these two different structures. The private one, though, picking up your concept of co-investing, does have to have one independent director on the board that's called a responsible person. So the family can keep control, but they must have one person that's outside the family, usually an accountant or a lawyer or someone like that, that is sort of the community representative, as it were, to make sure nothing untoward happens in the way.
So there are some rules, some pretty specific governance rules that apply particularly to, obviously, a private ancillary fund, because a public ancillary fund, obviously the rules apply, but there is some strong structures and governance associated with that, where with the private ancillary fund, like it is left to the families to actually effectively administer, then an independent person comes in to really kind of, I suppose, ensure that there's nothing untoward actually does occur. As an example, in investment in the family's business, which would be something that would not be allowable. Maybe you could give us a couple of examples of the things that you can't do once you've contributed money into a private ancillary fund, which is the self-managed fund version of it.
Absolutely correct. There's not only the independent responsible person, but there are some guidelines and various things you're not allowed to do. And every private ancillary fund must be audited every year, and it must file a return to the ACNC, the charity regulator, and also the ATO. So there's an independent director. There is a requirement for audit, and that audit is not only of the financial statements, but also of the compliance with the guidelines, so with the rule. So you've got a very specific structure. There are 18 or 19 different rules you've got to follow, and that's in a way why we set up Australian Philanthropic Services, was to make sure that there's some experts around these rules to help people through them. I always say 95% of these rules are pretty self-explanatory, and if you're running a self-managed super fund, which a lot of people are, they're not too difficult to comply with. The last 5% can get mind-bogglingly difficult, and you often don't know when you're in that 5% of perhaps grey area, and therefore you do need sort of some expert advice. So the things you can't do, and the prime one, is you cannot provide any benefit back to the family that made the donation into the fund. I mean, there are a lot of other specific detail, but the main one is you cannot provide any benefit back, and every charity that you support must also have what's called DGR status. So that means because you got a tax deduction when you put your money in, you can only support charities that would also get a tax deduction if you gave directly to.
So it's that's sort of a deductible gift recipient is the DGR.
A deductible gift recipient. So instead of being a one-step gift to a deductible gift charity, recipient charity. It's become a two-step. You give it into the foundation then gives it to the charity. The foundation, a private ancillary fund, has to give away 5% of its value every year. So there's a requirement that you've got to make sure money flows out to the community. You can't just pile it in there, get the tax deduction, and just watch it grow.
And that's why they're a charitable trust, right, David? Because there are causes out there that may not be aligned with DGR status, and therefore, charitable trusts as opposed to private or public ancillary funds are set up to provide benefit to them, because a private ancillary fund cannot gift to a charity that isn't a DGR status charity.
Absolutely correct. So the downside of a charitable trust is you don't get the tax deduction. The upside is you can give to a much broader range of charities and charitable purposes. But there are 26,000 DGR charities and.
So there's a lot. It's not like you're going to miss out on giving.
So there's usually plenty of choice for most, for the key causes and key organisations that most people, want to support. And just to touch on the other structure, if the private ancillary fund is the sort of self-managed super fund version, the public ancillary fund is like the industry super fund, as I said. So that's you have your account. There is professional investment management that manages the money. There's the trustee also does all the compliance, all the tax returns, all that sort of stuff. And the individual donor then makes recommendations on, I want to support X, Y, and Z charity. The trustee has to obviously check that those charities are eligible to receive grants. They can't promise they're going to follow the recommendation from the donor, but the practice is it's best practice to take into account those donor recommendations. And the public ancillary fund, there are several to choose out there. Some have a very strong investment focus. Some have a more community grant making focus. Some are for profit. Some are not for profit. And there's a process called portability, which is a bit like rollover in the super fund. So a lot of people start off in a public ancillary fund, build it up over a few years. You've got a much lower entry point. Need only
so what would
40,
that entry point? Yeah, 40,000. Okay, yep.
40,000 to get it going in our case. And then down the track, if you build it up over time, perhaps you do that while you're still earning the big dollars in the corporate job and you're paying a lot of tax, so you can start building up a pot. Then when you retire and you want to be more actively involved in it yourself, you can then roll it over into set up your own PAF and move the money across, or ask for the money to be moved across into a PAF. So you've got flexibility to move between structures. So, we often see people use the public ancillary fund as the way to get started. There are no setup costs. You don't have to have an extra structure. You don't need to worry about responsible people and audits and all the rest of it. And you just can sort of put your toe in the water, as it were, on structured philanthropy. So that's the one we are seeing growing fastest at the moment, but it should be growing even faster than what we're seeing.
Yeah, I wonder whether, somewhat the issues that we've been having geopolitically, the cost of living pressures, things of that nature, is sort of stalled a little bit of the altruism, or whether there's something else at play. Although it does seem that in America there seems to be a greater movement towards that, but there's also a greater wealth inequality in America as well. So I'm not sure how the stats play out, but.
And in a way, because tax rates are often lower in America. I mean, people paying, the top tax rate here, 50% of their money is essentially going to the government at the margin where they're earning. And, those on big salaries, you would think, I've probably looked after the kids, I've fed the family, I've, done everything I need to do. There's perhaps a little bit of money that can be, as I said earlier, better spent giving it away and supporting the parts of the community that are really struggling, rather than perhaps, changing the colour of the curtains or something.
Can we just, to tie this off before we get into the tangible and intangible benefits of the structured giving approach, but this idea of a sunset foundation versus like a legacy foundation, and why different families have different views. I think there's a movement towards these sunset foundations now. Yeah.
And it's a good observation. The idea of the sunset, or those that are really focused on that, is saying, look, there's some real problems in the world today, and particularly on climate change. Take that for instance. A lot of those families that have climate change as a prime reason of why they want to do something for the community think, right, I'm much better to spend the money now when the real problem is biting, rather than perhaps dribble a bit of money out and over the next 30 years, because in 30 years it's going to be too late to deal with climate change. And the other end of the spectrum, I suppose, are people that support scholarships at universities or research grants or something like that, where they know there's got to be ongoing effort, and therefore they say, right, I just want this to continue on in perpetuity. So the idea of a sunset clause is the whole foundation will spend out within, I think Bill and Melinda Gates, the largest example, they said 25 years after the death of the last of the two of them, the trustees that take over have to spend that money out. Now that's going to be in their case, a serious task, because obviously there's a lot of wealth there.
Yep. So to move over into why families give in this sort of structured way, what are the sort of tangible and intangible benefits that you might be able to describe that are afforded as a result of moving into this space?
The tangible ones are probably the most important in some ways. And look, was I can remember a lovely story from one of our clients, and this was new wealth, so someone that had grown up themselves in pretty trying times, and struggled through, but then finished up with a trade, and then set up their own good business. And when they sold that business to the US, they had a bit of money that they could set up a foundation. Now, they had given their children the absolute best and everything that they didn't have as part of investing in their family. But they were a little bit worried that by giving them all that opportunity and good schooling and all the rest of it, that the children perhaps weren't as grounded in the nitty-gritty of life, as it were, that some people affect. So they wanted to engage the kids in the philanthropy. And the story goes that the mother was driving the two kids to school to drop them off, and Mum had been dressed up a bit, and they said, "Oh, where are you going today, Mum?" And she said, "Remember we told you we set up a foundation, and we asked you for ideas of who we should support." And one of the kids, was very strong on supporting animals in parts of Africa, I think it was. And the other said, "Mum, I've been thinking about that." Now that surprised the mum a little bit to start with, and she said, "I think we should help victims of domestic violence." She said, I see these kids at our school who are really struggling. So what's it like in a public school where the kids are struggling even more and they don't have that sort of wealth to support them? And, the mother just got, whoa, the younger people were much more engaged than she'd realised. And therefore that foundation really focused its efforts into victims of domestic violence as a direct result of that engagement with the kids. So it changed the family dynamics to the better, and they realised that the kids weren't as isolated as they perhaps had thought. So that intergenerational family glue, roll back 100 years, and it was either we probably all were on a family farm that gave that glue, or a family business, whereas obviously today more people are like to be employed in big corporations or whatever, so there's not a glue to hold the family together. And philanthropy and giving part of the money away can be part of that.
I think the structured giving approach is a way of creating like a conversation around something that has to happen. So it has to happen that we're going to give something as a family, before the end of the financial year as a result of it. So the conversation has to happen, and that is what creates this ongoing dialogue potentially with the kids. Now, it doesn't mean that other families can't do this, don't have the ability to give in a structured way. They can do that, but it is on them to bring up these conversations with their children, which, when you get busy and the rest of it, sometimes just doesn't happen. But in this structured approach, whether it be that you use a public ancillary fund or a private ancillary fund, it seems to me it creates a momentum towards having these conversations by the nature of the very function of having the structure in its existence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Because the requirement, you have to give away 5%. So if you've got $1 million in there, you've got to give away $50,000 each financial year. Therefore, it's not that you've got a choice of no, I'm not going to do that, or I can spend it some other way. It's you got to give it away. You just got to work out who you're going to give it to, and let's have a family discussion. And some families would say, right, that's $10,000 each, pick your choice. Others will say, let's spend, half it on one project that we all agree on, and then everybody else might choose a smaller project. Sometimes all the kids get together and have a bit of a debate and work out which one between them. So there are a whole lot of different ways that it can be done that just, suit the particular personalities, perhaps, of the families. There's no right way or certainly wrong way of doing it. It's just what works best for each particular family.
It's funny, something just came to mind, as we talk to our clients in our private practice around, to what extent does a gift during a lifetime or even through inheritance potentially have the effect of being unhelpful to a child in their development. And often there is quite strong feelings around spoiling children. But what is not actually necessarily addressed all the time is how can we do the opposite of that? How can we get kids thinking of things other than themselves, or perhaps what car they're going to get once they finish VCE, And it was just an interesting thought that I had, that we think about the negative, we're not thinking about the positive ways that we can impact kids. Because yes, we might not give as much to our kids in the form of a gift now, but maybe that could be somehow structured in such a way to have a nominal amount or a small amount, or what we can, to provide to charity, which has long profound benefits. I've heard from many people now.
Absolutely right. And I think Warren Buffett's got a great phrase, something like, leave your children as much that they can do anything they want to, but not so much they can do nothing.
Yes.
And, which I think is a great phrase. Now, obviously, he's talking with a few more zeros on the end than we are. But the principle, yeah, I think, is a great one, and just working out, what gives people a sense of satisfaction. Like, I'm sure, like you, Joe, we often have a Melbourne Cup, lunch when we run a sweepstake, and for the last 4 or 5 years now, we've always, when we're allocating out the horses, we always have whatever those horses that are left over, or even a person, allocated to charity, and they get the last, 3 or 4, sometimes it's 5 or 6 horses in the pot. And then, interestingly, I think out of the 4 of the last 5 years, the charity horse has always come first, second, or third, or last. Therefore, got an allocation of the pot. And then we sit round and discuss where we're going to give the money to this year. And one year it was for, I think, the Syrian refugee crisis, and the next year it was the RSPCA. And then often someone who won the money say, well, actually, I don't need it. I'll throw my winnings into that money that's going to go to the charity. So that's sort of made a bit of fun out of, an event that's always a fabulous event, and charity benefits. So you can do a lot of things to really extract some personal value and joy from that giving experience.
Yeah, and I really want to just emphasise the fact that whilst not every family can afford or has the capability of giving in a structured way like that, there are many modes of helping and many ways of doing so. And I think, the structured giving approach then enforces some of these issues at the coalface with families, but it can, if you are so inclined, you can drive it as a family leader yourself, and certainly, as you've talked about the Melbourne Cup sweepstakes sort of scenario. I mean, that's completely doable for most Australian families, I would imagine, which is super interesting.
And the other benefit, you say, not only it's in a way structured philanthropy is forced, but it also often is more thoughtful because you've got more time. Yes, you've got a 30th of June where you've got to spend the money, but often people start, even Christmas time, starting talking about it. You can, you can spend a lot of thought, identify which charity you think is going to be most suited to your particular. Once you've picked the area, then you look at the charity and then decide, right, well, that's the one we want to engage with, and then often have that discussion with the charity and work out, what do they need most that you can really provide benefit.
It's also, super interesting to me that I've been hearing about businesses getting more involved in charity in some way, shape, or form. Now, obviously, we have social enterprises and businesses that are, providing a pretty significant portion of their profits to charity to address issues, whether it be Who Gives a Crap or Thank You, as an example. There are examples of it, but also just businesses potentially engaging staff in some form of charitable giving to improve morale, create better engagement with staff and meaning associated with the work that is being done. I know this is not something that potentially is done, hasn't taken off necessarily, this particular aspect of things, but I wonder whether there's a bit of a gap here and whether or not more businesses can get involved in this space.
Oh, I think absolutely, and there's sort of two ways. They're not choices because you can do both. I mean, one is whether you set up some sort of workplace giving structure, therefore staff can either give individually or give collectively, and then the business help. Then there's a committee that's established to then work out how you're going to give it. The other way is that giving. There's an organisation called Pledge 1%, where you talk about giving 1% of equity, 1% of profit, and 1% of time. And then you're not only giving profit into the foundation each year, you're also allowing staff members to spend a day, a half, or quarter, or sometimes a month, working on projects that aren't sort of mainstream for that business. And the benefit of that is not only for the community, but as you indicated, Joe, the benefit is the engagement of staff, and people want to go and work in that sort of organisation. Particularly, I think, younger people, they really associate with the values of the organisation. It's not just the organisation selecting the individual; the individuals are selecting the organisations that they want to put their CVs forward to, because they see that is a company that has really good values and is taking its community social license to operate, as it were, very, very seriously.
So, outside of awareness, which is what I think this episode is trying to remedy, what do you think the impediments are in people getting more involved in charity? And perhaps you can break down at some point the myths that people hold around philanthropy or charitable giving.
I think awareness, Joe, is by far the biggest, and there is a Productivity Commission review underway at the moment, or investigation, looking at how do we double structured giving in Australia by 2030, and certainly the submission we put in is that so many people just don't realise what tax breaks there are, particularly out there for giving. I mean, well, one of the ones I haven't mentioned is, if you make a large donation, to set something up, and then it turns out for some reason you don't actually have the income to fully utilise that donation in a particular year, you can, roll over part of your donation to subsequent years out to another 4 years. So you don't have to use it all up this year. And when you sit down with your accountant, you can work out how much makes most sense to utilise in this year or next year. So you've got some real flexibility. But the three myths that I often talk about, I better make sure I get these right. Is the first is that you don't have to be dead. A lot of the big foundations are people. Alfred Felton here in Melbourne, who's just gives so much of the NGV. When you walk around it, you can go into a room and there'll be 25 fabulous historical artworks there, and 23 of them have been given by the Felton Bequest, which is a charity that was set up more than 100 years ago. And only half of the money went to the Felton, to the NGV. The other half helped, women, children, and the educated poor, the most disadvantaged in society. So, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, clearly still alive. So philanthropists today very much alive. And going back to our early discussion, you can enjoy giving it away if you're alive. Leaving it in your will doesn't achieve that joy. And it's not as tax efficient as giving it while you're alive. The second is you don't have to be Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, as we talked. You can start your journey on tens of thousands rather than the millions, and start to understand how philanthropy works. And the third is, it's actually not that difficult. You can set up a giving fund in a public ancillary fund with the likes of Australian Philanthropic Services easier than you can set up a bank account. It is not complicated. You can work out which charities you want to support through an online portal. You can put more money in whenever you want to from your internet banking account. I mean, it is actually really easy, but just people don't really know, particularly about public ancillary funds. They might have heard of a PAF, but public ancillary funds are really sailed under the radar for a long period of time.
Yeah, so whilst it's easy in implementation, I think what we would say is that based upon the conversations we're having, I think people really, if they're interested in something like this, they really need to consider, and I would strongly advise seeking any professional assistance to work out what is appropriate for them in their particular circumstances as well. Just want to stress that point because we've talked about quite a little bit about the ins and outs of these structures. But of course, David, you are a technical resource at Australian Philanthropic Services. You would not have a job if it was that simple, in the sense that there are so many rules and regulations and the rest of it. So, I think it's important to just note that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And in fact, the financial advisory industry, I think, has got a crucial part to play. And we and one of my colleagues are talking to the upcoming Congress in Adelaide about its structure of philanthropy, and equally there are others that are trying to make sure it's now and part of the education of financial advisors, because often they are the people that do talk to clients about about their money and their wealth and how much they might need and how much can they perhaps afford to give away. So I think financial advisors have got an important role to play in this. Financial advice is not about just adding an extra few zeros on the end of things. It's financial advice is about how do you get value from your wealth, because money in the end is back to our stage one economics. It's a unit of account and a store of value. On its own, it doesn't actually do anything for you. It's about what you can do with money is what really delivers that personal value or family value or community value.
It's a really awesome message, and I think today's episode has been great because to me it's really traversed the areas of family, how giving can really impact a family's culture and its values, and also how it can actually affect one's career as well, in the sense that, if employees or employers are involved in a giving approach as well, how a sense of meaning can come as a result of that, but also a sense of community and a sense of belonging as well, the ability to, really help our neighbours, whether they are domestically based or whether it's, beyond our own borders. All of these areas are areas that we focus very strongly on within It's Never About Money. And David, you've really assisted in being able to express how giving in general, but also specifically your area of expertise, structured giving, can really assist. So we thank you as a community. And also, I just wanted to ask you to round out, as I do with all my guests, what your spirit animal would be and why you would be that spirit animal. That's a question without notice. It's probably the hardest one you've ever been asked, David.
I think, being a New Zealander, I would say Kiwi. And part of the logic of that is not just I'm a New Zealander. I've got the very fortunate position. My parents, 50 years ago, bought into this sort of communal farm that, which is also on an island that has a population of Kiwi on it. And most Australians don't realise most New Zealanders have never seen a Kiwi in the wild. They are quite rare and quite endangered. And we've got this place, and we're woken up at night with the Kiwis, frolicking around in the back garden. And it's an extraordinary privilege to be in that sort of position. And they are the most amazing sort of animals when you see them pecking around, looking for, grubs and things that they eat. So part of my sort of role in that is sort of being on the wildlife committee is, how do we make sure what we do is protect them and allow them to thrive. So, trapping for rats and predators and keeping dogs away and cats and all that stuff is all part of it.
So we don't just see them in zoos.
So, but seeing them in zoos is nothing like seeing them running across a field. I mean, they're all walking over your boots when you're standing there looking at them. It's at night, they're nocturnal, so you've got to have a torch on, but they can't see red light. So if you wear a bit of red plastic over your torch, you can stand there and just watch them. And it's, So I think it have to be a Kiwi.
That's incredible. That's amazing. What a little story at the end. Thanks so much, David. Again, really appreciate you coming on. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Joe, my pleasure. Take care.
If you have resonated in any way with the sentiments of this podcast, we would be delighted to direct you to our website, www.itsneveraboutmoney.com.au, for more free resources and education aimed at improving your capacity to make sound financial decisions for the benefit of your family. We wish you every success, however you define it.